Well, in the last 48 hours, Russia's invaded Ukraine. And I'm sure by now, everyone really knows that. Now, in this video, I'm not really going to talk about the ground operations or the sort of physical military operations because that's outside of the scope of this channel. However, in concert with the Russian ground operations, there have been cyber operations, and these occurred even before, almost as if you would in a traditional sense, artillery usage, which was also done before their ground troops moved in. These cyber attacks occurred even the day before, the day of, while the physical ground troop military operations were occurring at the same time. And it's becoming more clear to me that these cyber operations are becoming a staple of Russian military doctrine. So it doesn't seem like it's something that will be going away soon, especially if something like this aggression is kept up. So, let's go into it. Hey everyone, my name is Seth, with Seth on Security. In this channel we talk about security topics and news that comes up relating to cybersecurity and even physical security that can be somewhat technical in nature, and we try to break them down and then bring in some of the ethical implications and things like that into the scope of our discussion. If you like this kind of content, please like the video, please subscribe, and let me know what you want to see. All right, first, let's go back in time just a little bit to get a look at these modern operations. Not very far, only about a month. So we can look at these operations and get a better understanding of how this is being done. So, just back a little more than a month ago, January 15th, a set of malware that was named Whispergate actually was reported to have been deployed against Ukrainian targets. So what is Whispergate? Whispergate is a malware that contains 3 individual components that were likely deployed by the same adversary. So these components were a malicious bootloader that corrupts the detected local disks. It also included a Discord-based downloader. And then the last thing it included was a file wiper. This activity actually also occurred on January 15th at the same time that multiple Ukrainian websites were being defaced. And these weren't just any Ukrainian websites, these were Ukrainian government websites. So talking about the malware has an installer component which overwrites the master boot record of an infected host with a new bootloader that displays a ransom note. So when the host boots, what the victim sees is a ransom note. And at the same time, however, that's not really what's going on. The victim thinks they've been infected with ransomware, but at the same time, the disk is being wiped on the infected host's hard drive. So this is a bit more sinister, and we talked about stuff like this in my previous video, actually. So here's some of the kill chain when it comes to this malware. The victim receives the payload, and that attempts to wipe the master boot record. The master boot record, so we can be clear and everyone can understand what the MBR is, all that a master boot record does is looks for a target device to boot from, and it tries to basically tell the computer what it wants to boot. And that's a very simplified way of putting it, but it tries to tell the computer where to look to start the operating system. So this malware specifically attempts to wipe the master boot record, which, as you can imagine, would make the computer unable to boot up. At the same time, it doesn't stop there. It also tries to destroy the C drive partition by overriding it with fixed data. So even if the master boot record could be repaired, then the C drive would be destroyed anyway. There's a second stage, and in that stage, there's a downloader. That's the Discord downloader. And that fetches the third stage, which is a DLL file, or a dynamic link library. The DLL drops a 4th stage wiper payload, which is now the wiper, that removes all the data on the endpoint. Pretty bad. I think the most interesting part of this malware is that it contains an actual ransom note in it, and seems to suggest that the data can be recovered, but that really is not possible. The Whispergate bootloader, it has no decryption as normal ransomware would, and there's no data recovery mechanisms. So it's not really ransomware. Even though it looks like ransomware, it doesn't lock the files. It can't recover the files. It is simply there to get rid of everything. So remember that, and now we move to the present day and within the last 24 to 48 hours, multiple cyber attacks were launched on Ukrainian entities. These were specifically government entities and state banks or financial sector organizations. There were major DDoS attacks that brought down infrastructure in both of those sectors as well. A DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service, is essentially sending all kinds of packet data that is junk in order to overload a service and prevent the usage of that resource, ties up the resource, and it is unusable. Now, these DDoS attacks were used in various campaigns in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, as well as in Georgia in 2008. So, at the same time as these attacks were occurring, it seems like they were part of a little bit of a bigger operation, and that is the planting of the disk wiping malware that has been dubbed Hermetic Wiper. So, let's talk real quick about what Hermetic Wiper is. So, not a lot is known about the Hermetic Wiper malware other than its entire purpose is to wipe computers. The Hermetic Wiper was found on a number of organizations in the Ukraine shortly after, within hours, of those DDoS attacks that I had just previously mentioned. The first detection of this wiper malware was actually done by ESET, which is an antivirus software vendor. Very interestingly, and this is one of the most interesting things in this whole case, the malware has a compiled timestamp of December 28, 2021, which means that this malware had been written and completed and compiled since before the end of last year, and it was ready to go. All that needed to happen is that they needed a place to put it so that it could be used. How did the Hermetic Wiper wipe disk drives? Well, it misused legitimate drivers of popular disk management software. Think of the kill disk malware that I mentioned in the previous video, and it works in a similar fashion. The wiper malware uses the EaseUS partition manager drivers to corrupt compromised devices' files before rebooting the computer. The data wiper also trashes the device's master boot record, rendering all the infected devices unbootable. Not only are they unbootable, but of course all of the data on them is removed. A representative from Symantec, which is also looking into the incident, had actually told Reuters that infections had also spread outside of the Ukraine and were seen in some of the Baltic countries, such as Lithuania and Latvia. Now, some things to think about when it comes to other countries. Is it really likely that this Hermetic Wiper could be spreading to other countries? I personally do not think so. It does not have the same kinds of capabilities as the NotPetya malware, which is also believed to be attributed to Russia, and those attacks occurred in 2017. It doesn't have the same wormable capabilities that malware possessed. A wormable capability simply means that a piece of malware is self-replicating and can move on its own, right? If a malware can replicate somewhere else, then it is wormable, at least if it does it on its own. Whispergate and Hermetic Wiper are very, very similar pieces of malware and seem as though they were designed specifically for these attacks. So with that in mind, I don't think it is something that would spread to other countries. Some of the other things that I like to touch on here and there include some of the implications of these kinds of malware and the real-world issues that could occur if this is used in the wrong way. As the world gets more digital, there's a lot less paper records that are on file for a lot of things, and sometimes it can be the case where if a digital record is removed, it is entirely gone. That's not good. More and more institutions have moved away from keeping paper records and have moved their inventories and other paper infrastructures into digital content management platforms that they can use much, much easier. Now, I'm sure and I hope that any of those platforms would have all kinds of security controls, including offline and off-site backups for those pieces of data that are critical or otherwise confidential or otherwise not replicated on a paper record. So if a piece of malware like this were to spread far and wide as it did in 2017 in a similar way with NotPetya, which was a ransomware rather than a wiper, there could be further complications when it comes to mission-critical systems. So, Russia has attempted to deter other countries' actions in the Ukraine as far as intervention, promising serious consequences. So, I don't know that the consequences would mean nuclear war, and I also don't know how much of an incursion would be needed to cross that line. However, I think cyber attacks are a great bet, and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the United States, and the FBI have already issued bulletins on heightened awareness for Russian threat actors that are targeting United States businesses or government entities, as I'm sure we'll see an increased presence in. And without getting into too much politics, the U.S. has stated that if Russia conducts offensive cyber operations in the U.S., they essentially will wish that they hadn't. It sounds like, to me, that they are very prepared to do some hackback kind of action and cyber warfare of their own. And from my own research, it's that the U.S. is very good at offensive cyber operations. They certainly have a dog in that fight if it were to come to it. This also makes me think of how many disruptions to our daily lives we might see. Think about another Colonial Pipeline kind of attack, but that's on a nation-state level instead of a less sophisticated ransomware operator. Another interesting point was the compiler date being in December of 2021 for the Ukrainian malware sample. So that means that this has been in development and even completed for almost 2 months. Who knows how many other pieces of malware that are ready for other nation states that have been fully reconned and are ready to be deployed or are ready to be used in an attack in those manners. We may find that if other nations are attacked and samples are reverse engineered, they have similar dates or dates well before the attacks actually occurred. So hopefully all organizations around the world really keep best practices in mind, as the more involved every country gets, the more likely it is they are to be attacked themselves. Of course, those best practices include maintaining thorough and regularly tested and protected backups that are also offline, develop business continuity plans, segment their networks, limit access to high-risk assets, hopefully keeping all their systems and their software patched, and hopefully they have an antivirus product or an endpoint defense and response product and are responding to any alerts that are occurring. Another piece of perspective on this is that, unfortunately, Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in Europe. This probably means that they have very dated digital infrastructure and likely poor cyber hygiene practices. Their GDP is actually less than the Philippines, and the average gross monthly salary is only $639. So it's hard to have a robust cyber defense without funding. And cyber operations, especially offensive ones in other world powers by Russia, will be a lot more complicated and would likely come with other repercussions. So essentially the battle isn't getting any easier for them if they attempt to come for other world power nations. Hopefully this gives you guys a little bit of perspective on some of the early attacks that we've seen in the Ukraine. If you like this video, please like it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you guys for watching.